It's 9 o'clock. Wow, I hear myself echoing.
Voice from heavens.
Voice from heavens. Are we okay with the sound? Sorry, give us a minute. Technical challenge. Okay, well, it's still having the echo. Sorry, it doesn't happen every day, but sometimes. Can I get you something? Oh, okay. Sure.
I'll be back.
Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you very much. Thanks for the communications team. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion about Xi Jinping's vision for Sinocentrism and the implication for the US, China, Russia Great Strategic Triangle. My name is Yun Sun. I'm the director of the China program and co-director of East Asia program here at Stimson Center. As you know, that our China program has been focusing on China's foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and and China's strategic vision for the world for a good 2+ decades, if you count in my mentor Alan Romberg's work here. So today we have had the pleasure to include, to have Professor Gilbert Rozman, who is my co-conspirator about this book. Xi Jinping's quest for a Sino-Centric Asia, from basically covering the past 3 U.S. presidencies, the past 3 U.S. administrations. And Gil Rozman does not need any introduction, but he is emeritus professor of sociology and the editor-in-chief of the ASEAN Forum, a bi-monthly online journal on international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. And he taught at Princeton from 1970 to 2013. He's an amazing or unbelievably prolific writer of books. And last time that I checked, you have published 48 books, or it was more than 48, I think. Well, more than 48. So definitely a role model for all of us working on China, working on Asia, and working on foreign strategy. Also today, we have the pleasure of having Professor Sergey Radchenko, who traveled from London to join, from Bologna. One of those places in Europe, but I can share the good news that he is moving to Washington, D.C. in the near future to be back to the headquarters of SAIS. Sorry to make the announcement for you. Professor Radchenko is a distinguished professor at SAIS Europe, and he currently is a director of SAIS Bologna Institute for Policy Research. Previously, he was professor of international relations, Cardiff University, and he has an international reputation for research on history of the Cold War. I think you remember last time that we both spoke at Columbia University, you introduced yourself as a historian. And historic historian. And for the history part, well, the history between China and Russia definitely has a lot of implications for the relationship today. So for the discussion today, I would like to give the floor first to Gil to talk a little bit about this research about Xi Jinping's vision for Asia's Sinocentrism and the implication for not only the region, but also for the world. And then we're going to dive into the question of China-Russia relations. What is this, reverse Nixon actually means for the strategic triangle, and we'll go from there. So Gil, let me give you the floor to talk about the book.
Thank you, Yun. It's a pleasure being here with Yun and Sergey. I was so pleased when Yun agreed to join in writing this book, along with Danielle Cohen, who can't be with us today, but will be available for a later webinar focusing on Southeast Asia. We wrote this book with the goal of trying to understand what is China's foreign policy in Asia over the Xi Jinping era. And so we began by, through the help of the Asan Institute and the Asan Forum, preparing papers to go through 3 stages of Xi Jinping's thinking. One to 2017, the second to 2020, and the third to 2024. And in each stage, we wanted to sort of seek truth from facts, the Chinese label, for trying to understand things that aren't necessarily readily apparent just by reading sort of official statements. And so we dug into Chinese publications, Chinese statements, and we tried to figure out what was really the intention of Chinese foreign policy bilaterally and regionally across Asia, beginning with Yoon's work on the U.S. role in Asia in each of these 3 periods. And so we ended up coming up with an overall sense of what Sinocentrism means. Usually, it's hard to figure this out because there's no official Chinese statement. It's sort of a concealed strategy or identity of what China has in mind. And we could not summarize some official documents. There's a historical background, Tianxia, but that is really more the historical tradition. It doesn't give us a sense of what's really going on. It's not the Monroe Doctrine. It's much more integrated economically and demanding culturally. It's a civilizational perspective. It's a hierarchical perspective. It doesn't take sovereignty that seriously when it comes to certain territorial themes and cultural themes. And it's something that needs to be dug out from what is being said about particular countries. My own focus is Northeast Asia, so China-Russia, China, the Korean Peninsula, and China-Japan. But we also added Gaia Christofferson and China, a chapter on China-Central Asia, and we did China and Asia's southern tier, ranging from India to Southeast Asia to Australia. So I think it's pretty comprehensive in building this picture from the ground up. And we came away with 3 distinct periods in how Sinocentrism has evolved. Not that Sinocentrism didn't exist earlier. I think it had a big role to play in what Sergey has deeply studied in the history of Sino-Soviet relations. For instance, the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s. It had a role to play in the breakup and China's rejection of Japan's efforts to steer regionalism in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think it's been very important at each stage afterwards. But Xi Jinping adds a special touch to it. He is more explicit about the China dream, regaining China's role in the world and particularly in Asia. And therefore, we tried to understand it. And what we found was that in each period, China's approach to its neighborhood becomes more assertive. And we can find examples of that in the first period we called the takeoff stage. Saying to Obama in 2013, let's divide up the Pacific into 2 spheres, essentially. Developing the Silk Road economic belt as a challenge to Russia's hesitancy about cooperating in Central Asia fully. Developing a stronger stance towards Japan, and of course, by the end of this period, punishing South Korea with a assertion that South Korea's THAAD defense system violates the understanding of what South Korea's foreign policy should be according to China. So that was the first period we see this building up. And then in the second period, we say Sinocentrism is taking flight. it's really going much further ahead. And, you know, President Trump gave General Secretary Xi Jinping an opening, of course, in some of the new tensions emerging between the two. But we really think much of it is due to the greater confidence in China about its ability to take a more forceful role in Asia. So the response to the Hanoi summit, not rejecting North Korea's position, putting more pressure on South Korea, the border incursions with India, some more pressure on Russia in terms of how it would interpret multipolarity, the militarization of the South China Sea, the rejection of Abe's approach to free and open Indo-Pacific. All of this characterizes the second stage. And then we go to the more recent stage, and we talk about Sinocentrism in full flight. The way China responded to Biden's effort to de-risk by calling it containment. The way China responded to Russia's war in Ukraine, abetting the war in important ways. The cozying up to Russia, but also applying some new pressure to Russia. The demonization of South Korean leaders as if they'd broken from a sense of balance in foreign policy. So there's much going on over this period. And looking back, we see no pausing in this process of Sinocentrism, but also an understanding that unlike maybe the America First approach, it is long-term, it is flexible, it treats different states in different ways. Some end up being treated like a wolf warrior victim. Others end up with a certain amount of deference. For instance, Russia, which China regards as its very important partner. And so this is a process that is ongoing, and in this process we have to take into account the fact that China is now steering it in the context of a new American foreign policy, adjusting it, and America's response has to understand what China's overall process is, how it's proceeding, not a one-shot response, but a gradual effort to counter what China is doing, to take advantage, for instance, of Sinocentrism as a policy that can alienate other countries and maybe, as we'll soon be discussing, Russia. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Yoon.
Thank you for that comprehensive introduction of basically the theoretical evolution of our thinking regarding this book. And in the China field, we often have this joke that China doesn't really have ever had a theory for international relations, because the only theory that China has ever known in terms of international relations is a hegemonic stability, with China being the hegemon. And the historical tradition of China being, well, remember the English name of China, the Middle Kingdom, being in the center of the universe, means that China is center of the universe and is surrounded by tributary states, by barbarians on its borders, and by vassal states, right? So Sinocentrism, therefore, seems to be a theme of China's approach to international relations. And I think in our book, we also explored the assertion that, well, basically what Xi Jinping is trying to restore China's rightful place in the international system is a return to that historic significance. But that raises a question: where does that leave Russia? Because Russia is also a great power in the Eurasian continent. We know that during Trump 1.0 in 2017, I still remember quite vividly, the top concern of the Chinese strategic community back then was, what if there is a rapprochement between Trump and Russia? And what would that mean for China's strategic environment? And now we're at Trump 2.0, and the discussion about reverse Nixon, basically towards the end of the Biden administration, we were already hearing this term called CRINK, C-R-I-N-K, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea as the new axis of evil, or the traditional axis of evil. And how would the Trump administration deal with the crink? And the proposal that seems to be most popular, and I'm sure everyone has heard a lot about it, is reverse Nixon. United States in this strategic triangle should pursue rapprochement or pursue a closer alignment with Russia in order to counter China, which is a long-term strategic threat of the United States. Well, there are many, many obstacles, as you can imagine, to that approach. And I was in Beijing recently, and given all these talks, they're happening very quickly about the ending of the Ukraine war between US and Russia. My observation is that Beijing was shocked at the beginning by just how fast things has evolved. Putin made a phone call, and in a week there's a meeting in Riyadh, followed by more meetings in Riyadh. I think 2 months later, Beijing is also developing more confidence about the limitation of this engagement between Russia and the United States. I'm happy to share why China thinks there is a limitation. There are 3 reasons. The first one is I think that Putin is stringing Trump along, that there is not a fast ceasefire in horizon. Putin needs another 6 to 12 months in order to achieve the military goals on the battlefield, so he can entertain the ceasefire dialogues and maybe entertain the idea of ceasefire on a monthly basis. But he will not necessarily cease fire in a more permanent fashion. The second reason is because of the energy dependence that has developed between China and Russia. In the Chinese oil industry insider's view, the international energy market is currently a buyer's market. So Russia, as a supplier of energy, well, last year supplied about 20% of China's crude oil import globally, has also developed this dependence because of the infrastructure that has developed, but also the potentiality of European countries continuing to reject energy resources from Russia. So there's some level of confidence there. So the third element is that I think China is more confident about the long-term alignment of interests between China and Russia vis-a-vis the United States. Maybe not the West, because Europe is currently in a very awkward position. But in Beijing's view, there's more to the China-Sino-Russia alignment than just merely the Ukraine war. They look down the road into the future, into the horizon. They see many layers of factors that will align these 2 countries together. So Sergey, what's your thought on that? Do you agree that reverse Nixon faces innate problems and challenges? How far can it go? And where does Russia sit on this vision of Sinocentrism in Asia?
Thank you, Yun, and thank you, Gil, for the presentation of the book, which is fascinating, and I really look forward to reading. I would like to begin by recounting something related to what Yun said with regard to North Korea, crink, etc. I was also in Beijing and Sanya a few weeks ago in a track 2 dialogue on the subject of North Korea. Actually, there were 2 iterations of it. One was the Sino-American track 2 dialogue on North Korea, and I guess I passed for an American to participate there. And then there was another one in Sanya where I was a notional Russian, but there were other Russians there, real Russians who were like, who the hell is this guy? But anyway, it was really interesting because you could see there is a sense of frustration among the Chinese participants about North Korea, that the North Koreans are extremely difficult dealing with. We knew that, right? We knew that this relationship is problematic. We know that the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un is very problematic. And there's no love lost between them. So I wonder, as China pursues its Sinocentric ambitions, having even its closest neighbors with which it's supposed to have a relationship of lips and teeth in this kind of sorry state, you wonder how challenging this is going to be. But the interesting thing is that the Russians were very keen to, and this was sort of before, this was right before Trump's inauguration. Yeah, it was before Trump's inauguration, so there was no clear view in Russia as to where the relationship with the United States was going to go. So the idea from their side was, well, how do we actually invigorate our relationship on a trilateral basis? Of course, they also have their relationship with Iran that is fairly close. In terms of practical cooperation, military cooperation. Their relationship with North Korea is very close in practical and military terms. But what they wanted, it seems, was closer Sino-North Korean-Russian relationship, coordination perhaps. They haven't had trilateral consultations for years. That's something they would like ideally to return to. And I don't know where the obstacle is. What I got a sense of was that the North Koreans were the main obstacle to this. But the second obstacle are the Chinese. The Chinese do not want to be seen in such a sorry company, not least because they have interests in Europe. We know that at Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi was just really trying very hard to appeal to the Europeans. And frankly, after J.D. Vance's speech, China's, what the initiative again, security, civilization, bring it on. It sounds much better. So you could kind of sense that view in Europe as well. And I think the Chinese understand that. I think they understand that this is a good moment to play that card with the Europeans to drive a wedge, to do reverse Nixon on Europe, so to speak, and drive the Europeans and the Americans apart. And in that context, doing anything like a building of an axis with the Iranians, about whom they know nothing, the North Koreans, who clearly hate China, and the Russians, who are, to be fair, are a long-term reliable partner. I don't know if that is something that the Chinese are perfectly comfortable with. I think from their perspective, it is much better, and I don't know if you would agree with that, but it seems much better from their perspective to pursue those relationships on bilateral basis, especially build up that strategic partnership with Russia that the Chinese do understand is very much in their interest and something that they would like to strengthen. And that actually, I think, goes much deeper than the present relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping. And with that, I would just, if I may, very briefly reflect on the state of this relationship, because I think it does matter in the context of our broader discussion of the triangle involving the United States as well. Where are we in this relationship? I mean, the first thing to stress is that the movement towards rapprochement between China and at that time the Soviet Union began in the 1980s. I mean, Gil knows the story very well, having in his time researched that back when, written about this as well, and I have written about it back when. This relationship began in the 1980s. By 1989, we have Mikhail Gorbachev in Beijing meeting with Deng Xiaoping, closing the past, opening the future. By the way, that's probably the only legacy of Gorbachev's that's stuck around. A very successful move there. And then you move into this period in the 1990s when the relationship become closer and closer. One of the things that I discovered in Moscow while I was working for a time in the archives, where I had pretty good access up to year 2000, was Sino-Russian discussions in the late 1990s. Absolutely fascinating. So you have like the Chinese ambassador, for example, telling the Russian leadership at that time, we have to stick together no matter how much the Americans put us under pressure, because it is in our interest. It is in our long interest, and it is in China. And this is Li Fanglin's words. Li Fanglin was the ambassador. His words were, China wants to see Russia strong. And that's interesting, because that same idea comes up later again and again. And if you compare that rhetoric from the 90s that they used in internal conversations among themselves with what has become public with Putin and Xi Jinping in the very recent years, you see that there's continuity straight through, because the Chinese already then perceived Russia as an important as an important partner that will allow them to kind of to serve as a lightning rod for American pressure, as it were. So the Russians being there will protect China in important ways. And go back, you can actually Google it, 1997 statement, the joint statement signed between China and Russia, Yeltsin, Jiang Zemin. It talks about, guess what, multipolar world. It's right there in that statement. So those ideas that today we would say provide a kind of a ideological foundation for a closer Sino-Russian relationship are not ideas that Putin and Xi Jinping brought into this relationship, but ideas that have been formulated over years and years and decades. So this is, and that's why this relationship is fundamentally quite healthy and fundamentally quite strong. Compare where we are today to, let's say, where we were in Sino-Soviet relations in the 1960s and the 1970s. At that time, China perceived the USSR as its main enemy. The Soviets were accumulating forces on the border with China and talking about a preemptive nuclear strike. The Chinese were digging tunnels under Beijing in preparation for that, right, expecting that. There was that fear. There was a fear in Moscow that the Chinese would somehow carry out their irredentist territorial claims and potentially invade Siberia and go as far as Kamchatka if Mao Zedong's words were to be believed. In other words, there was fear, there was militarization on the border. It became one of the most militarized borders in the world. Where are we today? Border issues have been resolved, basically, between China and Russia. There are no border issues. Of course, we can say, well, somebody, we always and occasionally the media write about it, saying, oh, look at this, the Chinese map, spell Vladivostok as Haishenwai or something like that, which, by the way, has always been the case. And it's true. I mean, if you look at some Chinese maps, for example, go to Heilongjiang official government website and check out their maps, it turns out that, for example, they present this little island close to Khabarovsk as fully Chinese as opposed to part of it being Russian. I've done that, right? I've checked it, and I don't know how to explain that, frankly. It doesn't make any sense because they have actually resolved those issues, but it's not like any Chinese leader is currently actively making territorial claims to Kamchatka, right? This is just off the grid. It's not there. I think there's an acceptance that the border issue has been resolved, and that's very important. There's been a long-term red herring about Chinese migration into Siberia and how they would eventually take over Siberia and how the Russians are supposedly afraid of that. None of that is actually real, right? None of that is real. The Chinese migration has not materialized. The Chinese are not taking over Siberia. And in fact, the main reason for that is because life in China is actually quite decent compared to life in Siberia, so they just want to stay in China and not try to cross the border. And there are other reasons as well, cultural, administrative barriers, and so on and so forth. So from that standpoint, the relationship is pretty solid. Yoon, you touched on the economic issue, and that I think is an estimated aspect, which I think is an important factor at bringing these two countries together. This is not a competitive relationship economically. Russia provides oil and gas. China provides machinery, electronics, consumer goods, and so on and so forth. Look at the list of car manufacturers that dominate the Russian market today after the exit of Western car manufacturers, and the Japanese and South Koreans as well. You'll be surprised. The top 10, you've never heard of those cars, right? Unless you would have heard about them. But most people here have never heard of these cars. I've never, when I saw the list, I was like, what are these things? But evidently they've made great inroads into the Russian market. So it's a very beneficial relationship. And some people will say, well, but no, that means that basically Russia has become China's vassal. I don't know what this means. I don't know what being a vassal means in this sense. The fact that Russia sells oil and gas to China? Okay, Russia used to sell oil and gas to Europe until it got cut off. Does that mean that Russia was Europe's vassal? That doesn't make any sense. Russia is dependent on Chinese technologies, partly because, of course, it wants to escape from that economic isolation vis-a-vis the West, and it would love to import those technologies from the West, and it's doing that through parallel imports and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that it is somehow afraid of this economic relationship with China. And more than that, China, although it does, you would seem it would have with the kind of economic ties that it has with Russia now, of course, it's Russia's number one trade partner, and the bilateral trade is currently at more than $240 billion. You would think that China has leverage, and you might say it's leverage, but it's not useful leverage. What can China realistically do to crack the whip and tell the Russians, if you don't do this, we will, I don't know, impose economic sanctions on you. They have done that with other countries. They have done that with other countries, for example, with Mongolia. They've done it with Mongolia when the Mongolians, remember that episode when the Mongolians invited the Dalai Lama?
Yep.
There were economic sanctions imposed by China. The next day, the Mongolians capitulated the day after this, right? But that's because 90% of their trade exports goes to China. The Chinese really have leverage. But this is a very narrow set of issues, and I don't see Xi Jinping understanding how important that partnership is for China. I don't think he'll be in a position to say, hey, if you don't do what I want, I will then, crack the whip and will impose economic sanctions on you. That's not how the Chinese approach this issue in my mind. I think the Russians understand this. So economically, politically, regionally, in terms of border issues, this is actually a very good relationship. And if you look at this situation from the point of view of Russia, you want to have a good relationship with China. Why would Russia want to have a bad relationship with China? That's totally crazy, right? You want to have a good neighborly relationship with a country that is a massive country that is right next to you, that is, moreover, an important economic partner. So even if Putin was run over by a bus and you had somebody who was more pro-Western, or at least more willing to engage in some sort of re-engage with Europe, I would think that new government in Russia would also want to continue to have a good, productive relationship with China for as long as the Chinese treat Russia with respect. And I don't see any reasons that they wouldn't. I think the Chinese learned from history. If you go back, Gil, you mentioned the Sino-Soviet split. Why did this happen? Why, there are all kinds of theories. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on it, and the argument that I made back then was that the Chinese were simply unhappy with their role as a junior partner in this alliance. They did not want to be the underdog. They did not want to be the younger brother. I don't think that China is treating Russia as its younger brother. I think there's a sense of deference, and yes, they have areas of disagreement, including in sometimes over Central Asia. We know there's some issues over the Arctic that they disagree about. We know the Chinese were not particularly enthused when Putin resorted to nuclear rhetoric during the conflict in Ukraine. So there's some issues where they disagree, there's no doubt about this, but I think by and large, the Chinese have learned from history, and they understand that you want to treat Russia as a daguo, right, as a great power, and not as a vassal, and there's a difference there. So in this sense, I think they've come to, I think the Sinocentrism, going back to Sinocentrism, coming around back to from where we began, Sinocentrism obviously places China at the center, but I think for the Chinese, they somehow reconcile or have reconciled it with the idea that there will be other centers of power out there, and I don't think we're in any immediate danger of the Chinese trying to bring Russia in as a part of the Sinocentric world as a vassal of some kind.
Thank you. That's really a great segue to I was told that the mics were fixed, so let's give it a try. A segue to Gil, your comments about the trajectory of China-Russia relations. I fully agree with Sergey that I think China and Russia have found a way to coexist in the same neighborhood, although both of them have their distinct ambitions, and this relationship has never been problem-free. But the question is always whether they see the interest or the benefits from their alignment as outweighing their disputes or their disagreements. And I agree with you. I think the Chinese prioritize bilateral relationship more than a trilateral alignment among China, Russia, North Korea, partly because the Chinese have been opposing the bloc mentality. They have been criticizing NATO or the bloc mentality as a source of instability. So forming a trilateral alignment would play into that the narrative that China is forming its own bloc. But Gil, what do you think? You've been observing this relationship since 1970s, if not earlier. There have been ups and downs. There have been different ways to manage or reconcile their differences, sometimes successfully, and in some cases unsuccessfully. So would you say that currently it's in the best shape and has a solid future?
Well, I want to stress two things as we move up from the book coverage to the grand strategic triangle, as some people have called it. First, I think there's a very important role for thinking about triangularity. This is a book I did in 2022 talking about the post-Cold War era in terms of triangles with a chapter on the grand strategic triangle. And I think there's also a very important role to think about tensions in Chinese-Russian relations. Sergey's points I greatly accept and agree, but I think there's something more going on. There have been a lot of tensions, and I attribute many of them to Sinocentrism and Russian wariness, nervousness, when it comes to identity issues like the history of Vladivostok, when it comes to Central Asia, where China has made some significant inroads, and just in the last 2 or 3 years, when it comes to the Northern Sea route and other themes, Russia accepts China as one of the top. But it also is talking about, of late, the Yalta II summit, where China, Russia, and the United States divide up their spheres of influence. And there's actually some optimism in Russia under Trump that they may get to this kind of second approach to dividing up the world, which for Russia is a reaffirmation of Yalta I. It gets the U.S. now to say Russia has its legitimate sphere into Eastern Europe and beyond, and it gets China to more clearly affirm Russia's position in Central Asia, which I think is somewhat doubtful because China and Russia have rather different notions of the Eurasian region. And this is played out. And the book that came out 2 years ago, looking at the Russian counterpart to this discussion over a long decade of Chinese foreign policy, this time is Russia looking at China year by year, and what were the strains? You could find in Russian writings concerns about Sino-Russian relations, just as you can find them in Chinese writings. So I would argue that the grand strategic triangle was neglected. Sergey has brought us back to what Chinese were saying to the Russians in the 1990s. They were already talking about triangularity. We need Russia to strengthen ties with us and to work together to limit U.S. unipolarity. We were forgetting in the West international relations studies about the importance of this triangle. I think China went further in reaffirming this, although the term multipolarity disguises triangularity and gives Russia a sense of what it has, rather than sometimes the bipolarity that the Chinese actually discuss when they're talking about Sino-U.S. relations and their importance in putting Russia somewhat to the aside. But I do think that by the 2010s, and even before Xi Jinping took charge with his China dream and his new emphasis on neighbor relations, there was a reinterpretation of the triangle. And Putin strongly believes in this triangle, although for him, India serves as the fourth country. it is a major country. China hasn't treated India as a Dagwa, as a civilization center in the same way. And that's one of the tensions. It's also a challenge now with the U.S. relationship with India and Russia, both possibly strengthening. Is there a new triangle with the U.S., Russia, and India figuring out how they can work together? Russia would love that. I don't think the U.S. has yet given thought to India's effort maybe to try to take advantage of this degree of triangularity, particularly in limiting China's influence. So I would regard India as very important for understanding the process of Sinocentrism and the triangle. I also think Kazakhstan, as we go to Central Asia, Kazakhstan wants to have a very distinct and independent role, as discussed in our book. But really, there's also the question of, can Russia and China keep their agreement as on this upswing in their relationships when Kazakhstan and Central Asia pose a problem, and China is, despite its relative deference to Russia, is still driven by a Sinocentric logic. And in various cases, whether in North Korea or the Polar Silk Road, there is some sense that what China wants may not correspond to what Russia is willing to offer. So I see that as important. And actually, the country that I think is the special test for China and the U.S. in this triangle is South Korea, because China has treated the Korean Peninsula as sort of its first circle in the concentric circle approach to neighboring countries, which belong under China's civilizational leadership. Where is regionalism advancing? And I don't think they're going to be very tolerant of the kinds of things that South Korea is being asked to do by the United States. So in this triangle, as we look at where it be tested and where Sinocentrism might be the big theme, those are the three countries I would point to.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So I do want to remind our audience that for the people participating online, there is a Q&A function on the app that you can submit your questions related to the topic today. We have about 45 minutes left for I'm sure it will be a very fruitful discussion. I have so many questions, but I want to start with Sergey about this. The future of the China-Russia relations. Well, politically, there are enough elements that will give them the incentive to build a closer alignment for the foreseeable future. But you mentioned something that I thought is interesting, which is the economic potential of the China-Russia relations. Because the traditional view is that, like you said, that China is a customer of energy resources and Russia is a supplier, so therefore they're naturally mutually complementary. The question is, how sustainable is that? That looking into the future, China's economic future lies in high-tech, supply chain upgrade, AI, quantum computing, you name it. And it doesn't seem that Russia plays a significant role in that particular domain. And Russia, of course, is one of the few countries in the world that still runs a trade surplus vis-a-vis China, primarily thanks to the energy trade. So if you have to look into the future, look at the crystal ball, and look at the bilateral economic relations between China and Russia, how much growth potential you see in what areas or domains that they will potentially enhance their cooperation or expand their economic cooperation? I agree with you that the automobile market is quite brutal. Before 2022, I think Chinese cars were less than 10% on the Russian market. By the end of 2024, Chinese cars occupy more than 65% of the Russian domestic market.
But the interesting thing is that the Russian consumers were actually quite happy with that, and there was not a revolution, and Putin was not overthrown as people were, trying to get back to their BMWs or whatever. That did not happen. An adjustment took place. Yoon, I think you're right in pointing to the limitations. The kinds of the growth that we have seen over the last 3 years is obviously in large part a reaction to the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and Russia's loss of markets, also at the exit of Western companies from Russia. So the reorientation took place and we had dramatic growth, but that has more or less exhausted itself, and we're already seeing a certain fallback in some areas simply because, well, in the end, Russia is not such a gigantic country, is it? It is territorially, but economically it is not. China will remain Russia's #1 trade partner for the foreseeable future. And that has been the case since before the war. I think this was the case from something like 2008 already. So China has been Russia's #1 trade partner. For China, of course, Russia is not all that significant. Although I think last year it graduated. Russia has entered the top 10. I want to say of its trade partners. So finally, they at least they appeared on the ratings. There's some potential for further increase in the export of energy resources. We know that Putin has been really hoping to open another gas pipeline to China. And for me, that has been a measure of the limits of the so-called unlimited partnership. The fact that the Chinese are not agreeing to that pipeline, they're negotiating over the price, and that has been, the Russians have already years ago have proclaimed that everything was a done deal, and of course it's not a done deal because we don't have a pipeline. It's not close to being realized, and that is a serious problem for Gazprom, obviously, because Gazprom has lost its export markets to Europe. And has really nothing else to rely on, but really is hoping to increase its exports to the Chinese markets. And yet, as you mentioned, despite those limitations, Russia has now emerged as China's #1 supplier of energy in recent months, and that is not likely to go away, even if Chinese. Whatever direction Chinese economy takes, because there will be need for oil and gas, in particular gas, of course. There's no indication that Chinese demands for it, demand for energy will decrease. From Russia's perspective, there is a degree of sensitivity around over-reliance on the import of Chinese technology. That said, they wanted even to promote further cooperation with the Chinese. For example, they hope to have a development of a joint civilian aircraft, and the Chinese vetoed that. So that did not go very far. But otherwise, I think the relationship is economically stable, but there are limitations to growth, as you say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's something that we're observing in terms of the limitation, because yes, in terms of energy, there's great mutual complementarity. But if you look beyond energy, at one point in 2018,
there's also food, by the way. There's Russians are suppliers
supplying
of grain
agricultural
products.
Agricultural products, yes. So when China was cutting back on the soybean import from the United States, in the Chinese policy community, there was this proposal that Russia could supply soybeans to the Chinese market. And then they realized that the Russian production is too small to even fulfill a fraction of the Chinese demand, the import of soybean, which is why China's pivoted towards Brazil. But that's a slightly a different angle. I have a question for both of you. For this relationship, apparently leaders play a central role, right? The book talks about Xi Jinping centralism, and we know that Putin has been driving the Russian national strategy for the past, how many decades? And there is a belief that this, I won't call it bromance, but this affinity that Xi Jinping and Putin have for each other has greatly enhanced the intensity of the rapprochement or the alignment between China and Russia, which raises a question that if you look down the road, to what extent future leadership changes in either country will have a significant impact over the shape and the direction of this relationship and what it means for the United States, right? Gil, may I ask you for your wisdom?
This is certainly a strong relationship. They've met so many times.
We lost count.
Yeah, we stopped counting, and they want to present it as so terrific, and it partly is a response to the Sino-Soviet split when they both rethink. They blew it. They really ruined their position in the world by allowing that split to go on for 3 decades, and so this is very important. But basically, I think there's a lot of a cat and a mouse game between Xi Jinping and Putin. Xi makes an initiative, and Putin is taken aback and has to do something in response. I think 2013 was really an indication of that, when Xi moved towards the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia, you know, has never directly joined. The Eurasian Economic Union has a connection to it, but Russia, in fact, all of Northeast Asia is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so that's China's big initiative in drawing together Central Asia and Southeast Asia and so on, and yet India and Northeast Asia, nope. And so that's just one indication of sort of wariness about this relationship. And I don't think, despite Xi and Putin meeting so often and having such to talk about rapport, that it is that easy. On the other hand, I don't see another leadership pair emerging that could question this relationship. I think it's built on such fundamentals and assumptions about identity and their place in the world, and there's no other way they can accomplish their goals without remaining closely tied together. That's my point.
I agree, Gil. I mean, like I said, the relationship is deeper than Putin and Xi Jinping because it's older than that, I think. Already in the 80s, they understood that that split was not good for them. And you know, when people say, well, but they're such wonderful friends, I question that because people like that don't have friends, right? I don't think Putin has any friends, and nor does Xi Jinping. It was interesting to see them. Remember that moment when Xi Jinping came to Moscow, and that moment by the car where Xi Jinping was leaving and said, "We're driving these changes together. They're changes that have not been seen for 100 years, and we're driving them forward," or something like that. That was an interesting moment. There is probably a greater degree of trust in that relationship that exists in Russia's relations or China's relations with other world leaders, and for good reason. I think fundamentally, for all the bromance that we're currently seeing unfold between Putin and Trump, fundamentally the Russians do not trust the United States because they feel that this is, you know, Trump can go in any direction. Today he loves Russia. Tomorrow he'll say, you know, Russia is a loser, and let's, you know, impose some sanctions on it or something like that. Who knows? It can happen any day. And then beyond that, there's a basic instability about American foreign policy that everybody in Russia is aware of. Every 4 years, you don't know what's going to happen. So you can have a change of leadership, and then everything will fall apart. With China, there's an understanding that it's a more of a permanent thing. And even if Xi Jinping finally retired and somebody else came to power there, I think there's a general understanding of policy continuity, that China's policy will continue as is. And the same, by the way, rightly, I think the Chinese have the same view about Russia. If Putin, like I said, dropped dead today, which may happen, and somebody else, who is there in Russian policy community, in the current, you know, leadership, who could actually have profoundly different views about China? There's nobody there. Even Yeltsin, when he emerged as leader of Russia in the early 1990s, there were some people around Yeltsin at that time who were sort of radical liberals who said, how about we just break off relations with China and have good relations with Taiwan instead, because Taiwan is a fellow democracy. Yeltsin would not have any of that, right? So none of that, because I think there's a consensus in policy circles in Moscow that you want to have this good relationship. But just before leaving this subject, I really wanted to just highlight one thing about Yalta. I agree with Gil about the Yalta thing, right? The Russians have an obsession with Yalta, The Chinese don't, for good reason, because when Yalta happened, one of the results of Yalta was the Russians imposing, at that time, the Soviets imposing a treaty on China, which led to the effective de facto recognition of Mongolia as an independent country, and Stalin got a bunch of bases in China. This was not very, Chiang Kai-shek was not very happy about Yalta. No, he was not very happy about Yalta. So as far as Yalta is concerned, I think the Chinese are right to have reservations about it. And it is interesting, when you think about the division of the world in spheres of influence. By the way, I think that Yalta does not really, if you try to apply Yalta framework in Europe, that's going to be problematic, because unlike in 1945, where Europe lay prostrate and the Soviets could project power deep into the heart of Europe, today it's no longer the case. The Russians are having trouble even conquering 20% of Ukraine, never mind extending their influence far beyond wherever they have fantasies, whether it's the Baltics or Poland or wherever else they want to see as their sphere of influence. The European countries that are there, they have agency. They are not willing to accept that kind of framework, right? So that is a major limitation. How that is going to play into that Yalta vision of the world. And then an interesting thing is how that, of course, plays into Sino-Russian relationship. And Central Asia is a key element. And again, even Central Asians themselves are not particularly keen to be just pawns in this. We know that Kazakhstan, of course, is trying to have agency and has a lot of agency in this relationship, doesn't want to be played by either China or Russia. So I think the Yalta thinking is certainly there in Moscow. The big question is how practical this is, and I don't think it's very practical.
Gil, any response to the Yalta mentality?
I agree. That's exactly what I think. I think China is very hesitant about Yalta, and Russia has dreams about being one of the top three and creating a new system, and China's not too keen on that notion.
That's right. The Russians always have this problem, and that's a historical problem. They have much greater ambitions than they have the means to reach those ambitions. That's a characteristic problem for Russia.
Yeah, and the Chinese vision, Chinese view of that is, but Russia has always been able to punch above its weight, which is something that I think Beijing fundamentally admires.
I mean, in a sense, it has.
Russia for.
It certainly has.
In many sense, it has.
Yeah. The Chinese take Europe much more seriously than Russia does. They want to diminish Europe, so Russia's the big power the way the Soviet Union was, and the Russians take India much more seriously than China does.
Interesting similarities. So would we all agree that regardless of the leadership in both countries, the direction of China-Russia relationship with the alignment is going to continue? There's a good degree of continuity here. But the variance might be in the speed and in the intensity and the degree of that alignment. Because growing up in China, I don't recall ever under Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao that Sino-Russia relationship was prioritized as a primary strategic choice or the option of China. But we're certainly seeing that under Xi Jinping, that strategic coordination between China and Russia is a foundation of China's grand strategy.
And the same, in a sense, goes for the Russians. But I think there's a nuance here with the Russians. The Russians have they do think that improving relations with the United States, for example, will improve their positions vis-a-vis China as well. So they are not averse to this notion of when we talk about reverse Nixon, etc. I think they will welcome that very much because they do feel slightly constrained by their, and I know it kind of slightly contradicts what I was saying because it's such a healthy relationship, et cetera, but that doesn't mean that the Russians don't want to improve their position, right? Because if the Trump administration then turns to Russia and say, hey, we want to give you options in case, in case you want them, you want some space to maneuver. Of course, the Russians will be so happy to take. They'll take every concession. They will pocket them very, very happily. And then they'll turn right back to China and say, look, how we're so expensive now. We're more expensive than you thought, so you better give concessions to us. I think that's actually a reasonable strategy for Russia. If you're thinking what is the best strategy to adopt, if you're Russia in this kind of situation where potentially you have Sino-American strategic competition, the right position would be to do what India did during the Cold War, i.e. kind of policy of non-alignment. And you say, well, already China and Russia are aligned, and that is true, but there are degrees of alignment. China and Russia do not have a military alliance, for example. That is very clear, and it's not going that way, right? It's not going to happen. So for Russia, I think to have options with the United States and with China is their preferred situation. And from that standpoint, reverse Nixon kind of makes some sense. In other words, in a given, let's say you have a conflict, a military, God forbid, let's say we have a war between China and the United States.
There's one question about that. What will Russia do in terms of the Taiwan contingency?
Exactly. If it's got option, it's not going to get involved in that one, right? It doesn't want to. It doesn't want to go that way.
Define involve.
So that's interesting, and that is exactly why we have to be very careful with this issue of reverse Nixon, what actually it means. If we're talking about getting Russia to break off its relationship with China, that's absurd. It's not going to happen. If we're talking about telling the Russians, look, we have a relationship with you, and in a situation where we have conflict with China, will you, for example, take a neutral stand and not, let's say, become China's strategic rear, etc.? That is that's a different proposition. I don't know, because today we have, think about it from China's perspective. Why, China doesn't want Russia to lose the war in Ukraine. Why is that? Because it doesn't want Russia to be weakened and, potentially collapse or something like this. This would be bad for China. I think the Russians probably have the same position. In other words, they don't want China to collapse. They don't want China to lose.
I would like to add another angle here. I think Russia has been concerned about what China might do in an asymmetric relationship, Sinocentrism. And therefore, they've tried various things. Their newest thing is use the U.S. and get some more clout versus China. China will respect us more if we have this U.S. relationship. And actually, I think that was one of the reasons they went into Ukraine. That China was concerned, Russia was concerned that they were losing to China. China was acting in a way that was not totally regarding Russia's interests. And if they took Ukraine quickly, they would build up their sense of your raising community, and China would respect them more. So I think the triangle still is a factor here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. And interesting, Sergey, you made the comment that China does not want Russia to lose in the Ukraine war. I absolutely agree with you. The more curious question is, does China want Russia to win?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think so.
I don't think
I don't think they want Russia to win. I think they want this war to be kind of wound down
as a
gradually.
distraction of the United States.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a distraction. I don't know that. They clearly don't want escalation. And when we had the nuclear episode in the fall of 2022, the Chinese were not happy about it. The Chinese made their opposition to nuclear use in Ukraine very clear to the Russians. So they fear escalation. Whether they want the war to wind down or just to, I think there would be the happiest situation for them would be an uncertain ceasefire where the Russians fail to restore their relationship to the Europeans, because that still means that Russia needs China, etc., and they will be more reliable in this. Because I think the Chinese do have a fear that the Russians, for all their proclamations of solidarity, will jump beds and do something else, that's why the Russians felt the need to reassure the Chinese so much after the whole phone call situation with Trump. You had the visit by Shoigu and his reception by Xi Jinping, which is very, very, in a sense, unusual. And then Putin also made proclamations of great solidarity with China and made a phone call to Xi Jinping saying, we're still friends, don't worry about it. Yeah. So the Chinese, the issue is the Chinese are worried. That is the.
Yeah, the Chinese pay attention to the very, very small details. And the comparison or the complaint that we have heard from Chinese interlocutors was when Xi Jinping had a phone call with President-elect Trump the day before, I believe it was January 17th, so a couple of days before the inauguration. Xi Jinping turned around and called Putin almost immediately to give him a readout of that phone call. So when Putin had a phone call with Trump, and he did not call Xi Jinping for, I think it was 8 days or 12 days, the Chinese were really anxious, said, we called you right away to give you the readout. Where's our readout? You called him, you had a conversation, you don't give us a briefing. So it really drills down to the level of the details. We got some interesting questions online, and I want to come to these questions. There's a question related to what Sergey you said about the China, Russia in terms of North Korea, the trilateral relationship versus three bilateral relationship. And Gil, I'm sure you remember that back in the treaty between China and North Korea of 1961, there is a mutual defense clause. And the visit or the accord or the agreement that Russia and North Korea signed in 2024 also includes a mutual defense reference. Mm-hmm. So would that translate into some level of competition between China and Russia in terms of North Korea, or it would translate into somewhat a de facto trilateral mutual defense agreement among the three of them?
Mutual
defense.
I think to suggest trilateralism in the absence of a specific threat goes too far. Mm-hmm. I think there's a good Chinese-Russian competition. North Korea is China's #1 goal for Sinocentrism. It's right there. It's so close to the heartland of China. They've got to have North Korea.
And the North Koreans know that, and they don't want to have anything to do with it, right? They're like, we're staying away from this thing.
Yeah, so I think it's case specific. Yeah. If the U.S. and South Korea, as in 2018, start direct talks with North Korea and leave China out, China and Russia have no use for cooperating with the U.S. and South Korea. But if it's North Korea provoking, that can change the notion.
Did you on your visit to Beijing, did you get a sense? I get this really interesting sense that the Chinese are actually very worried about North Korean militancy. Did you get that sense?
I get the sense. I think that they see that the crisis potential regarding North Korea is maturing.
Yep.
That North Korea has been put on the back burner by Washington for a number of years, and we know that North Korea's pattern is that, well, you don't want to deal with me, I'm going to do something to force you to deal with me. Mm-hmm. So I definitely see that there's a concern, but the answer to that question is different. The Chinese answer is that, well, the U.S. needs to talk to North Korea to prevent it from happening.
So this was interesting because before going to China, I had an op-ed in the New York Times with Dmitry Alperovich in which we basically argued that the U.S. should approach North Korea again and effectively normalize relations with it on the basis of recognizing North Korean nuclear status. The Chinese were just ballistic over this. They were ballistic because they said, well, don't you know what this is going to do? South Korea will get nuclear weapons, Japan will get nuclear weapons, and maybe Taiwan will get nuclear weapons as a result of that. And I said, well, this sounds more like a Chinese problem than an American problem. But anyway, it was a slightly provocative approach, and I accept that. But it was extremely interesting to see how the complexity of Chinese thinking in North Korea. To this question on 60, in the 61. I mean, in the 1960s, North Korea was playing China against Russia and one way, in the other way, and I think they know how to do that, and they still do that today. I cannot comment about the military relationship with North Korea and China. I can say that yes, there is this new treaty that has been signed and ratified and is now in effect between Russia and North Korea that commits Russia to the defense of North Korea. There is a potential for entrapment there, and that it always comes with this kind of treaties. This was a problem for the Russians in the 1960s because they had that treaty with North Korea, and that really became a problem for them in the late 60s when the North Koreans suddenly became extremely militant, were capturing American spy ships and shooting down American airplanes, and the Russians were like, well, we have nothing to do with this. We're not going to go to war with the United States or Japan or anybody else for the sake of your crazy fantasies. And so the question, I think, for the Russians will be, okay, yes, they do have this military relationship today, and the North Koreans obviously send their troops. Is there an expectation in North Korea, if they do something like vis-a-vis South Korea, that there would be Russian troops? My estimate is we're not going to see Russian troops in the Korean Peninsula. But that's just the kind of a feeling based on
Gut feeling.
observation of Russian foreign policy. They don't want to get involved in this kind of things.
Great. So no Russian troops in the Taiwan scenario, no Russian troops in the Korean Peninsula. Russia is observing non-interference principle.
Except for Ukraine, obviously. They know where they want to send troops, yeah. They only fight their own wars, not somebody else's wars.
That's a great comment. That's a great comment. Do we have any questions from the room? So maybe we'll go to Ben, please.
Ben Massengill, visiting Navy fellow. I appreciate the dynamics in terms of a triangle, but how does this work from its Sinocentrism if, say, the U.S. was to come on the poor end of a Taiwan contingency scenario where Russia both China and Russia are relying on the U.S. as kind of like a common opponent of this? How does this now work if the U.S. has now lost a significant amount of standing from the outcome of a Taiwan contingency scenario? And how does that even work with North Korea, where North Korea itself is also based most of itself on villainizing the United States?
Boy, that gets to the tricky question of the U.S. grand strategy today. Gil, please.
Sorry, it wasn't for the U.S. It's how does China and Russia, like, what is the day after I defeated the Americans? What is that?
Well, I think we go back to the notion that Taiwan is so important for China's reasoning about its neighborhood, about Sinocentrism, about its history, and so on. And we see already with Hong Kong breaking the bond, the agreement by 2020 in how China deals with Hong Kong, showing a sort of an urgency and impatience with Sinocentrism right there. So it just means that China is looking for an opportunity to move, but I think that depends partly on the circumstances of how the U.S. is willing to deal with that issue and whether the U.S. has organized a multilateral coalition that can adequately keep China at bay, and that I think is situation dependent.
But just related to that, if Sergey, I can push you a little bit further on this particular question. Russians won't send troops to a Taiwan contingency, but does that mean that Russia will not support China in any way?
Well, okay, here's an interesting case. You have a Taiwan contingency, and let's say sea lanes are somehow blockaded, and China is unable to get the energy that it needs from, say, by sea. Yeah. Will Russia step up and say, okay, we are going to provide that energy? And that is a super interesting question, and that is where I think this reverse Nixon thing kind of makes sense, right? I guess it depends. I guess the answer, it depends. And so I used to be of the view that there's no way that you can drive a wedge between China and Russia. And in a sense, the problem is the way we put this question. If we're talking about now, if we're talking about a current situation, we want Russia to turn away from China. So why would Russia do that? It's ridiculous. And of course, there's no way to drive that wedge. If we're talking about a potential contingency when you have a conflict, and Russia would like to rather stay out of it because it feels that perhaps you cannot really win by getting involved, it will, I could see Russia providing some help to China in a kind of in the sort of limited way that China is helping Russia and Ukraine, right, to a certain extent, and maybe even less, because people have said that, oh, you know, China is really helping Russia and Ukraine. China could do so much more when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, there are strict limits on what China is willing to provide. It's just so obvious. And the Russians, I think, will reciprocate by also saying, okay, well, we are willing to do some trade, but if you want us to go beyond a certain point, that we're not willing to do that. And I think where this point is depends on the state of Russia's relationship with the United States. So from that standpoint, reverse Nixon kind of makes sense. It's a potential contingency, in a potential scenario, not in the current situation, but in a potential situation in the future where you have a war, hopefully where we're going to avoid it, right?
Yeah, it's to temper with the quality of the China-Russia cooperation, where's the degree of their cooperation?
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we should dogmatically insist that Russia and China just love each other to death and will forever be together. It's not like that, right? It's not like that. The Russians see where their pragmatic, practical interests are, and you may disagree, and I disagree, that invading of Ukraine served Russia's national interest. I think it definitely did not. But beyond that, you can still have a conversation about what Russian national interests are, and you might ask a question: does let's say a full-fledged backing of Russia, or rather of China on the part of Russia, serve Russia's national interest? And I think you could have a debate about it, and they are thinking about that in Moscow as well. How far do you want to go in this kind of situation? Do you want to have a real a divided world into two blocks? The Chinese don't want to see that. The Russians definitely don't want to see that, because they talk about the multipolar world. Because in a bipolar world where you have just China and the United States, where's Russia? It's not there. In a multipolar world, they can say, hey, we're pole. And we're a pole. We can play like all of you against one another.
Equalize among all the poles.
Did you see Putin referring to the Chinese saying about sitting on the mountain and watching tigers fight?
Yep.
坐上观湖斗.
Yep.
Did you see that? I was like, wow, Putin knows Chinese proverbs. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think he also made a similar comment a few years ago that, well, if there's a Taiwan contingency, then, Putin, I think what he said was, well, we believe the Chinese have the wisdom to sort it out.
Yeah.
So it's a non-commitment. Gil, you mentioned Central Asia, and especially the case of Kazakhstan. There's some interesting dynamics there as well, because when China introduced Belt and Road Initiative, it was launched in Kazakhstan, right? And Central Asia is seen traditionally as a Russian backyard, front yard, whichever yard. So do you see this competition playing more vigorously out in Central Asia, or the game is lost? Also for Sergey, because Russia's economic capability is kind of limited outside its border and outside the Ukraine war currently. So does that mean that Central Asia has been drifting irreversibly or reversibly towards the Chinese direction?
I would have to refer to the chapter by Gaia Christopherson here, where she also wrote about this from the Russian point of view. This other chapter is from the Chinese point of view, and she looks at what's going on. I think that China is gaining in Central Asia. The C+5, 1+5 group, means China has its own direct contact with Central Asia, apart from Russia. But this is a complicated situation, because China is concerned about going too far and pushing Russia into some negative response. I think some of that was visible. Sergey may want to add, when the Russian troops came into Kazakhstan, when there was was it 2023? There was a
January 2022, yeah.
Event, and then the Chinese were a little bit nervous about the Russians going in. They weren't in.
Yeah.
And since then, the Chinese have gone further with their ties in Kazakhstan.
So I agree, Gil. There are certain tensions there. The Chinese, of course, have their little operation, quasi-military operation in Tajikistan.
Mostly for Afghanistan.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. But this is, sometimes this is presented as the first step in China trying to extend its kind of military influence into the region, and the Russians are very nervous about it, because they feel that this is where they have the burden of responsibility, as the Kazakhstan scenario in January 2022 showed. And of course, they did not consult with China, and the Chinese were upset, and they did not say anything. They did not really say anything. They were very quiet about it, because they didn't want any kind of people to profit from exploiting tensions between China and Russia on this particular issue. The Chinese obviously will continue to exercise massive economic influence over Central Asia, which by far exceeds the Russian influence. The Russians have their specific areas where they can still punch above their weight. And this includes, for example, such a strange area, seemingly as migration from Central Asia. Where where is the workforce? And we have to disaggregate here, because we're not talking about Kazakhstan. We're more talking about Tajikistan, Uzbekistan to a certain extent, Kyrgyzstan. Where are the migrant workers going? They're not going to China. They're going to Russia, and contributing to Russia's workforce, and that is very important. And their what do you call them? The payments home.
Yeah.
Remittances back home still are an important part of their economies. So the situation is complex.
And I suspect language probably plays a role, because
language plays a role, although
Russian, they don't necessarily speak Chinese.
No, they don't speak Chinese. I mean, the younger generation don't speak Russian either. But I think there's a greater proportion, certainly much greater proportion of the population that speak Russian compared to those who speak Chinese. Although there has been some change with the Chinese really trying to encourage the learning of Chinese, etc.
Confucius Institutes.
Confucius Institutes. Well, but also students from Central Asia going to
coming to China. Let's get another question. Alan Lipson. Hi.
Thank you. Ellen Lipson, overly expensive. I don't know if this is on. So I've heard the word influence and I've heard the word non-interference. I was really glad when you framed at the beginning that what the Chinese expect in their relations with their immediate neighbors is beyond the Monroe Doctrine. And yet we perceive that both Russia and China, sort of as a principle of global governance, have this sacred idea of non-interference. So I just welcome a little more discussion of whether is this something that Russia and China formally talk about, of what the alternative rules are compared to the liberal order of non-interference. But you implied that in fact they do have some expectations of how the smaller countries of Asia will conform to Chinese expectations. So I guess I'd like to just hear a little bit of a conversation about the difference between influencing the neighbors and non-interference.
Thank you, Alan. That's a great question. Influencing the neighbors. I'll go to Sergey first. Russia has great experience in that.
I mean, Russian experience is very much an imperialist experience. I think it differs from China's experience. China expects deference, but does not necessarily want to exercise imperial control. That's just my take. That's how I feel Chinese policy is towards its neighbors. It expects deference and does not want to exercise. The Russians, they want both deference, but they also want to exercise imperial control, which creates problems for them when they, run into places like Ukraine. But beyond that, what are there some special norms that they're trying to develop among themselves that would be drastically different from the accepted international rules and laws, etc. I mean, if you look at the Chinese rhetoric, they always talk about the UN-centric world. They don't want to abolish the UN. If you look at the 12 Chinese principles for settling the Ukrainian conflict, territorial integrity is there, sovereignty is there. All of those things are there. From China's perspective, you can see why they would want to have that. They certainly don't want external interference in their own country, whether we're talking here about Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong or something like that. And so I don't see in their discussion any stark departure from the existing norms. What's interesting is we had, of course, the statement, the February 4th, 2022 statement between China and Russia. I always recommend people to read it very carefully, because that has some interesting new formulations that at that time were really kind of novel, and that is the Chinese and the Russians trying to change the definition of the terms democracy and human rights. Did you notice that one? So they were like saying, actually, instead of taking the defensive position, saying, oh, those Western powers, Americans always try to teach us about democracy. What they're saying is, actually, we have democracy. Well, you think ours is not a democracy? Who are you to say? Well, you think you have democracy? We're the ones who have democracy. And the same thing about human rights, right? They try to fill those terms with new kind of definitions, but that's the only area where I see them trying to create norms. I think in terms of international interactions, there's nothing new there.
Would you agree that
Russia share some similarities in terms of influencing their neighbors?
I agree that there's a more Russian imperialistic approach and a more Chinese traditional approach that fudges the word sovereignty and non-interference. And you ask how China has responded to countries like Australia with the wolf warrior rhetoric, or South Korea when THAAD was deployed, or other instances with South Korea. There is economic pressure. There are informal sanctions. There is a sense that they can use economic means to achieve their goals without high-handed, direct interference and demanding particular changes in leadership, although they react quite negatively when the leader turns out to be someone who's not accepting the principles that they have in mind. So I really think this is a kind of interference, but it's not the forms that we often have thought about in the past.
But Gil, if I'm just, if I may make the following comment, it's not unique to the Chinese to resort to economic pressure, et cetera, and interfere in affairs of other countries. I mean, the United States is very famous for doing just that. So in this sense, I don't see that representing any new departure from international norms.
I would go further and say there's a strategy for creating a region where there's no criticism of China, where there's acceptance of the historical understanding of China's place in Asia, where there is criticism of any issue that affects human rights in China or China's core interest. And it's a full-fledged strategy where the U.S. may do this in response to specific circumstances. China has this long-term agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a competing narrative that we're seeing quite a lot. But I do remember that I think for China, one of the criticism, one of the observations in the Chinese strategic community about Russia and the Russia grand strategy is that Russians are too direct, that too confrontational, that when there are opportunities that you can just exert influence from under the table or for circumvent the full frontal confrontation and come from behind, there are so many ways that you can influence the outcome. But Russia, the Chinese analogy is that the Russians are boxers, so it's very direct, very confrontational, and the Chinese style is Tai Chi. It's 360 degrees or 720 degrees of circling around and then influence you from behind. But that's a very, it's an interesting analogy or comparison of the different strategic cultures, right?
I find in China, this is quite interesting, I find the Chinese, that they cannot choose whether they really admire Putin or whether they think that he's really stupid. It's a little bit of both. I think, well, that is kind of stupid thing to do, but on the other hand, at least he dared. That, and we don't dare enough, or something like that. I get that kind of sense, which is interesting. And I think it really all hinges on the outcome, right? If Putin is successful in his invasion of Ukraine and is able to actually impose the kind of Russian peace on Ukraine, which would be disaster for Europe and disaster for Ukraine, I think the Chinese will look at it and say, interesting that he was able to do that. Can we learn something from that? But it's that's an interesting comparison.
No, absolutely. The level of admiration, even from 2008, when Putin was the invasion of Georgia, the Chinese admiration was, well, look at Russia, just can do what it sets out to do and achieve its goals. But with the Ukraine war, I think the Chinese criticism for Russia has been that the biggest crime than starting a war is to start a war and not win it.
Exactly.
What was your plan?
It hinges on the outcome, right?
Hinges on the outcome.
That's right. So.
Well, great. We are at the end of our session. I can't believe that the 90 minutes just flew by. We could have hours and hours of discussion on this. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for sending your insightful questions. And thank our panelists, thank Gil and Sergey for sharing your insights and your wisdom. We're going to have more discussions on China's foreign policy, the grand strategy, and hopefully in the future bring you back to talk more about Russia. So please stay tuned. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Have a good day.